there. My name is Kay Byfield, and this is your ArtSpeaks Studio moment from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. And today I'd like to talk about contrast, because contrast is one of the most important organizational principles of art. And like all of the organizational principles, it can be applied to any of the elements of design. So the elements of design are line, size, shape, value, color, texture, and sometimes space. And you can have contrast in line, in shape, in color, in value, all of them. Let me show you some examples. So let's talk about contrast when we're dealing with line. In this case, the lines are pretty much the same width, the same kind of application, but changing direction in the line makes this square be in contrast to the rest of the field. And in this case, making the lines thicker and thinner makes there be a contrast. Let's look at texture. We can do texture in all kinds of ways. We can do the density of the texture. We can do the kind of texture, the look of the texture. In this case, we have two textures, and notice that they separate from each other because they contrast with each other. How about shape? A big geometric shape, small organic shapes, they separate. They're all shapes, the same element, but there's contrast because they differ from one another. Color, talking about value in color. We have a light version of the color and we have a darker version of the color. That's contrast. Contrast in value. That means that there will be a separation. We can see the shape because of the contrast. And talking about color again, let's talk about color hues and temperature and colors that are contrasting with one another. So here we have a green and a red, and even though in the camera it looks like there's a difference in value, they're actually pretty close in value, and they separate. Notice how the green pops out as a separate because of contrast. And here we have a contrast because we have a bright color, an intense color, and we're contrasting it with a dull color. So now we've seen that contrast can apply to all the elements of design, but typically when we talk about contrast, we tend to talk about value and about color. An important consideration in using contrast in any of the elements is that you have high contrast in some areas, but you have other areas of the artwork with less contrast. The reason for that is because if you have high contrast all over, then the image is too easily read and it becomes boring and uninteresting. A good example of that would be a sunset painting where you have the bright sky and then you have an extremely dark foreground that stands against that sky, and there's no middle values anywhere. A better choice would be something like this painting by Nita Engel, where she includes some middle values in the foreground which allow the eye to travel around the surface. It's still high contrast overall, but it's a much more interesting piece. The same is true when you have high contrast in any of the other elements, like I said, and you don't have any transitional areas. For instance, if you had an extremely intense painting in terms of everything is very bright, or with no dull colors or less intense colors, or if you had all over 50-50 complement colors, or you had half warm colors and half cool colors. In any of those occasions, the contrast doesn't allow you to move around the piece. Why is it not interesting when you have all of it being the same level of contrast? I would suggest that it's the same as when you're listening to a speech where the person does nothing but shout or whispers or talks in a monotone. We need those areas of difference, of modulation, in order to allow us to pay attention and stay engaged. And that's true in visual art just as it is in a speech. Contrast is important because most artworks rely on having a focal point. And the focal point is usually the area of greatest contrast, although it can be created by the use of identifiable symbols or faces or something that we know that attracts attention. However, in most cases, the focal point will be the place that you go to initially in the painting, and then your eye is allowed to travel around the surface, but it will come back to the focal point. This allows the person to enjoy the entire painting, get the point of what is being said. And the longer that somebody looks at the painting, because there are interesting areas, the better it is. On a more basic level, contrast is important because it allows the imagery to be read. Unless there is contrast, shapes will not separate from one another. Except for works by artists like Jackson Pollock, most two-dimensional art includes shapes or suggests them. Please notice that in the Claude Monet Waterloo Bridge painting, the value contrast is minimal, but the color contrast is the way that the shapes are created. The way that artists design their shapes and establish the areas of contrast is usually by doing a value study. Value studies become very important for most artists as a way to figure out what their shapes will be and the relationships between them. Even if they plan to rely on color or texture or one of the other elements in terms of contrast, doing a value study gives them very good, clear information. Okay, so let me show you how a value study works. Here's a reference photo of two young women talking, and let's assume that I plan to do a painting of it. Before I do that, I would create a value study, which would be only in one color, and it would establish the shapes and the relative relationships between them in terms of the lights and the darks. Once I do this, then when I go to design the painting, I've got my drawing figured out and I know the shapes are working, and I've also decided where the contrast is going to go. So even if the painting is going to rely on color like the Claude Monet painting did, doing a value study, in this case it's in 4 values, the white, a light midtone, a darker midtone, and a dark, allows me to establish that in this case, this face is going to be the focal point, with the gaze between the two of them allowing me to move around the piece, and some more interest in other areas where I've established shapes that are less interesting. The best part of a value study is that once you've done it, you can design any medium, any element using that value study. So here's an etching of a portrait of George Washington, and it's done with lines. But the variety in the lines creates the contrast. When we look at a close-up of this etching, we can tell that the direction and the density of lines create the suggestion of form. The point is, contrast is a key principle of design. Without it, most artworks wouldn't be understood and they wouldn't be nearly as interesting as they can be. And despite the general understanding that contrast is only about value, it actually can be employed with all of the elements of design, including line, size, shape, color, and texture. I hope this information about contrast and how to use it thoughtfully will help you make better paintings. Until next time, happy painting.